Hello, everybody. Welcome to our 5 o'clock press conference. This one's on the risks of human-induced earthquakes. We have two speakers. Christian Klose, he's a senior research scientist with Think Geohazards in New York. And Shemin, she's at the Department of Geological Sciences at the University of Colorado, Boulder. And after the speakers are done, then we'll open the floor to questions. Thank you.
I'll come up here. Yeah, thank you for coming. This year, basically, I came to AGU to present something more about the uncertainties, basically the risks of human-caused earthquakes. Last year, I published a catalog that took me 8 years to compile, and I was reading over 400 papers that people published over the last decades on human-caused earthquakes. And this catalog contains information on the magnitude of the earthquake, what mass was basically accumulated and or removed from the earth crust, and due to mining, due to filling of reservoirs, due to injection, extraction of fluids, geothermal energy production, and then putting this catalog into the context of geology. So we see here, for example, a combination of the mass change, because the whole theory basically that I try to educate is the more mass we move on the earth crust, the larger we can expect a magnitude earthquake. And today I gave a talk about the Wenchuan earthquake 2008, which was a magnitude 7.9 in China 2008. And we have there, for example, the Min River Valley, which was impounded or filled with water. It was the size maybe of Manhattan. And within 2 months or 1.5 months, there was a filling, accumulation of mass of the equivalent to maybe 1,000 Empire State Buildings. And so this mass shift, no geological process is able to come up with such a mass concentration in such a small area, except for a volcanic explosion. So, and that's why I argue that there is a chance that we can trigger earthquakes because of these mass shifts. And if you take this catalog, at the end, only 100 earthquakes qualified for analysis because of the quality of the data available. And looking at these different geologic regimes, basically, they say that there is a relationship with statistical significance, which is important, that the larger the mass shift is, the larger is the magnitude we can expect. And here you see we have ranges from kilo, megaton, gigaton, and teratons. So 2010, I basically published this catalog already, but only the numbers here, that we see an exponential increase in human-caused earthquakes coming out of these publications. This year, basically, Elseworlds 2013 published in Science magazine a different approach, saying, okay, what is the natural number of earthquakes we observe in the mid-continents of the United States? And we see 21 earthquakes per year, roughly, and then we see really an increase over the last 10, 15 years. Now we have 150 events per year. So the question is, why is that? Why do we observe so many earthquakes now per year? And here, there's the concern that it's because of technology that is taking place in the mid-US continent that causes these earthquakes. One hotspot that I mentioned 2010 is the Salton Sea. It's at the end of the San Andreas Fault to the border to Mexico. There's a geothermal power plant. And if you take the area, for example, and here we talk about the risk, basically, what is the probability of having a human-caused earthquakes in relation to natural earthquakes? Taking this area around this geothermal power plant, we have maybe a 5 times higher chance of an earthquake of above magnitude 3 than in this whole area in Southern California. And keep in mind, San Andreas Fault is basically ending here, and in Southern California, basically, we expect a major earthquake of a 7th magnitude. So tickling the fault where we expect an earthquake, it's basically not the best way to do. We see here the number of earthquakes basically as a graph. Since the 80s, the production increases and we come up to magnitude changes, mass changes similar to the Siping-Pu Reservoir in China of 2008 I mentioned before. Here's this, just to show this relationship. Another example was this Chinese earthquake. Just to clarify, here's the water level change. We see here the monthly event rate of earthquakes. That was prior the reservoir filling. We see no correlation between the event rate and the filling. And then we see an increase in the water level, an increase in seismicity. In the dry cycle, the water level went down, seismic activity went down, and so on. So we have a continuation of response of the earth crust to the filling. So lastly, here on the left side, I want to point out now some statistical numbers. It's now difficult to say, or you can argue, okay, we have reservoirs. We have so many thousands of reservoirs built historically, so why is it so dangerous to have them? But reliable data we have, for example, in the US, and about 40,000 reservoirs were built, but only 1,000 to 500 reservoirs are large enough to trigger earthquakes that can be fatal. And actually, if you look historic data in the US, we have 2 earthquakes only that caused at least 1 fatality. And 2 earthquakes that cause fatalities in comparison to 1,000 earthquakes. We come up with statistics, roughly speaking. This is what I present tomorrow in the poster session, of 1 out of 2,000 earthquakes basically here. As at least 1 out of 2,000 citizens can be expected to be harmed who live in a 50 kilometers radius of, in this case, a fracking facility or a reservoir. So 50 kilometers radius is basically coming from this catalog. We have an area where earthquakes get triggered in this vicinity over a certain time period. And this logistic regression model I present tomorrow basically takes these parameters into account. And taking this number basically in context to other daily hazards we have, every 4th person basically dies in a lifetime. These are the life odds basically, dies from a heart attack. 1 out of 8 people dies on a cancer. And then we have another 1 out of 88 people dies in a car accident over a lifetime. These are numbers from the US basically. And here we have 1 out of 2,000 can expect to be harmed if they live in this area around such a facility. And in comparison, a flu is 1 out of 1,700. So we come up to areas, to numbers basically, that are similar to a risk we can expect for flus. And here on the right side, I basically plot a hypothesis that could be tested now is because the US will become the world's largest oil producer by 2015. This is what the EIA basically came out a couple of weeks ago, or days ago. And this is the gas shale, the gas and oil production from these gas shales, this so-called fracking. And the fracking itself is not the problem. It's basically the wastewater that gets pumped back into the earth crust. And these are large volumes. So, and this is dangerous because you have the East Coast very populated. And that's why that should be more analyzed. Basically my goal here is to raise concern that we need the energy, but we need to be aware of the risk. And that's basically the message. Thank you. Questions do we do at the end? Yeah. I think yours was right here. Mm-hmm. Right, yes?
Yeah. Thanks. First of all, and I'd like to mention that I'm a hydrogeologist. That means I study groundwater. And so some of you probably are familiar with the debate about Siping-Pu Reservoir and Wenchuan earthquake, and whether this Siping-Pu Reservoir played any role in triggering the 2008 Wenchuan earthquake. At the center of this debate, the debate is still going, at the center of the debate is that how well we understand the physics of water flow in rocks below the reservoir. And today, earlier this morning, I presented in a session that mostly focused on the physics of water flow. And so here are the concluding remarks that from this morning's talk. And the first item here is looking at the details of the water flow physics. And I looked at the two specific processes that specifically describe the physics of water flow beneath the reservoir. And one is something called undrained response, and I'm going to just very quickly explain that in a minute. And then diffusion. These are the two processes that we do need to understand in order to understand why reservoir-induced stress changes in the rock. And then the other 2 points that I mentioned this morning is that I think some of these has already published in 2009 Geophysical Research Letter paper, that the Sepingpo Reservoir is capable of influencing the stress to considerable depths of greater than 10 kilometers. And the reason that I highlight this here is because some of the, on one side of the debate is that people have been arguing that reservoir-induced seismicity are typically shallow. And here I want to state that from our study that we show that Sepingpo Reservoir is capable of doing influencing stress change to considerable depth of greater 10 kilometers. And then the final point that is the reservoir-induced stress change can really speed up the stress buildup in Wenchuan region. If it's not triggering earthquake today, but it speed up the stress buildup process. And so, as I mentioned, the focus of my talk this morning is looking at physics of water flow. And the reason that I wanted to highlight this is because the debate about the rule of water, there's some confusion. And so one part of the water flow is induced by something called undrained response, which means that when the reservoir is suddenly filled up with water, it's a big weight that's loaded on the natural surface. And then this quick loading of the water creates the stress below, and then this stress creates a pull pressure. That's what's called undrained response, which means immediately that pressure is generated below the reservoir. And then the second part of the water process is called diffusion process, which means that water sits on the natural surface. It's going to diffuse into the rock formation below, or the pressure is going to diffuse into the rock formation below through time. And the actual pull pressure, or the actual water situation below the surface, you have to consider these two processes. And I think a part of the debate about the rule of water is sometimes this part was ignored or overlooked, and that could produce a pull pressure picture that's not as complete as the water physics tell us should be. So anyhow, and that's what the two processes I mentioned this morning. And so the third column here is looking at the total pressure. And then in the vertical direction, I was looking at how pull pressure change with time. And I should also mention that these little green squares are rectangles, two-dimensional vertical cross-sections that shows the pull pressure distribution below the reservoir. And so, assuming the reservoir, if the reservoir is here, and then these red regions are higher pressure, green or blue areas are smaller pressure. So, and if you look at the pressure evolution through time, in particular at the early years, and for example, at 1 year, and the total pressure, you really need to consider the two components. If you just consider this one, and you'll miss some part, in particular this aerial extent. Okay, so that's the main thing that I guess the take-home message from this is that in study reservoir-induced seismicity, we have to consider the undrained response component. Otherwise, you will miss an important part of the water physics. And then, so some specifics about under the reservoir. Again, this is a two-dimensional cross-section, vertical cross-section. If you have a reservoir here, and these are blue and red regions represent the stress due to the reservoir, and blue regions means stable, and the red regions are non-stable, or due to the noding that promote slip. And so this is when you don't consider reservoir. This is what happens if you just have a reservoir here and you don't consider about water pressure. And this is where we come in as a hydrogeologist and as looking at the fluid flow processes. And this is a poor pressure that's generated due to the reservoir. And this is just a mechanical noding, and this is considered the actual water. And then if you put these two together, and this is what's the picture we should be looking at when we look at the stress below the reservoir. And the clearly, you can see the red regions where the stress is increasing, then the stability is decreased. And so that's, I guess, the second point that I wanted to, I went through this morning. And then just some general remarks. And one is that in order to study, understand water flow physics is critical when we want to study the reservoir-induced seismicity or wastewater injection-induced seismicity. And sometimes the devil is in the details. And however, to establish a strong causative relationship between a specific reservoir or a specific injection activity and the specific sequence of earthquakes, we do need to conduct site-specific studies. And because the geological systems are complex and they do vary significantly. And then other complex factors is that geological uncertainties such as faults that we didn't know before, or the rock properties that are not really very well characterized. And so these are continued challenge for us to understand the detailed stress field. But again, I think a site-specific study are necessary. And then finally, the point is that I think as scientists, as just a concerned citizen, we just need to be proactive. Preemptive studies should be carried out prior to all these engineered activities. I think that's the brief comment I want to make, and I'll take questions. Thank you.
Do we have any questions from the floor?
This is for Dr. Klose. Rick Lovett, freelance. Can you go through in a little more detail how you get that 1 in 2,000 figure? And how many people are in those zones that are at risk? Because that, you're extrapolating that from 2 deaths, or is this or is this a theoretical model based upon earthquake models?
It's basically a logistic regression model that calculates the probability of triggering from the initial start of the process, like filling a reservoir or starting mining. And the probability depends now on the geology, so it's getting more complicated. And that's the one thing. We deal with the probability regarding the production process. But on the other hand, the example I gave, this 1 out of 2,000 number, comes from if we have about 500 to, let's say, 1,000 reservoirs in the US that are large enough to cause a fatal earthquake. So we have 2 examples for the last several decades in the US that caused fatalities. So more than one, but saying, I'm now a citizen who lives there, I'm not interested how many people die, I'm interested whether I will die. So at least one has to die. to select these earthquakes, we have 2, so 2 out of 2,000. Multiplied by this probability from that process, you end up with 1 of 2,000, out of 2,000, basically. And that's the number it came up with.
Quick follow-up then. So this was for reservoirs, not for fracking?
No, because we do not have examples for fracking. So the only thing we can do is we look at other engineering processes that caused earthquakes and that had basically, based on this model, similar behavior. The more mass that is accumulated or shifted, you can do another model calculating the pore pressure change. There's so many physical processes in the earth crust due to engineering activities. Sometimes they work against each other, so you increase the pore pressure, but you take mass away, so you stabilize the crust. And in other areas, for example, you reduce your seismic hazard because of that. So it's not necessarily saying wherever you go you can cause earthquakes. You can do the opposite, basically. So it depends on this model and what you apply. In this case, it's the mass change, basically. And the good part of this global catalog was basically we were on different continents, different geology, different engineering activities, different scientists published papers over 50 decades. So the only thing what you would expect is randomness. But you see there are relationships that are statistically significant, and that was the surprise. So statistically significant, the more mass you shift, the higher is the maximum magnitude you can expect.
Other questions?
Hi, Liz Callagher from Environmental Research Web. Question for Christian. What does your finding mean in terms of people looking to start fracking projects and the response from local people?
Well, if there's a awareness and a willingness to educate the local citizens, it would be important to know what is the process of the production, what is expected to be produced or basically pumped into the earth crust. Alternatives would be to just clean this water and not pump it down, but it's too expensive, and that's why it's a cheap way to get rid of it. But that is not normally difficult to make this public information because it says something about the ability to produce, and it says something about the size of the resources you produce. So, but basically educating the public about how deep it is and what masses will be shifted. I mean, this model or this catalog talking about mass change, it reduced everything to a very simple parameter. How much mass you shift. I mean, there's so much more involved in this. You have to take the geology into account. Are you in a compressive regime? Is the earth crust pushed together, or are you in the normal fault regime? Are you opening it? Are you in a strike-slip fault like in California? And now it gets complicated to tell the public what is a strike-slip fault regime. I mean, but yeah, showing the production, it's the crucial part, and it was the crucial part for the last decades already, to get information about that.
Do we have any other questions?
I was interesting for Professor Ge in the one picture where there was an instability to the left. I'm not sure if it can be shown again, but it seemed to me that you were, I should understand this like adding two sources of that one. Yes, the one below, you add two sources of pressure, and you add the pore pressure, which is a pretty symmetric thing, and then still this results in a huge instability to the left. I'm not sure how that comes about.
The reason, well, this is, first of all, this is the Coulomb stress. Yeah, this is a Coulomb stress contour. And the way that Coulomb stress is calculated is based on the shear stress, normal stress, and pore pressure. And that also depends on the angle of the fault. And so basically how we calculated this is assuming the fault is having this geometry. And so this is based on if we assume that the fault that ruptured during the earthquake has this geometry, so this unsymmetric, and so this fault shape is this kind, and this is where the unsymmetry coming from. Pore pressure itself does not take into consideration of the fault geometry, where when you calculate Coulomb stress, you do need to consider the angle of the fault. That's where the unsymmetry comes from.
Other questions?
Yes, hi, this is Randy Shostak, reporter with EOS, newspaper of the American Geophysical Union. Christian, assuming that your calculations are correct, this seems like a fairly serious concern, or it should be a fairly serious concern. And I'm wondering, you mentioned that your goal is to raise concerns, so I wonder, have you reached out to decision makers and to industry, and if so, what has been the response that you've gotten?
Well, I think my first voice I have is at the conference. So I just present the research findings that I have, getting through publications. That's, I think, the better way to go to have a foundation of argumentation. Just reaching out to industry, I feel that would be premature. So at least from my side, I can say. So first conference, publication, and then we can discuss further details with the industry or concerned citizens, but that's my opinion. I mean,
anyone else with a question? Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you for your presentations, and thanks everybody for participating. We'll have our next press conference will be tomorrow morning, and that will be IPCC, the future of the assessment, at 8 a.m. Looking forward to seeing you then.